All right, welcome viewers and listeners. Today we have a special guest for this special episode. I'm pleased to announce that Mr. Adil Iqbal has joined us, and I would like to give a brief introduction about our guest today for the audience benefit. Mr. Adil Iqbal is a PhD candidate at the University of Brunei Darussalam with his area of research in globalization, which is exactly the topic that we would like to discuss today with him today. So, without any further ado, Mr. Adigbal, thank you so much for joining. I hope you're feeling
Thank you for
well.
having me.
I would like to. I was very interested when I found out about you that your main area of research is globalization. So globalization and its impacts and effects is something that I myself always tried to understand. But it's a huge topic. It's a vast topic. So for us and for the audience, can you give us an overview of your research and your understandings of what globalization is?
Thank you very much, Salman, for having me. I truly feel delighted. Let me tell you one thing that I'm your big fan. I'm seeing your work on YouTube, and I'm always read your poetry and the approach you have towards the realities of life. And I truly appreciate, and I myself learn from your thoughts and wisdom. So thank you for having me here. Now, globalization, yes. This is my research interest, and I'm pursuing my PhD research in the same topic. More specifically, my research is on the impact of globalization on Muslim culture. So, from the very topic, you can understand that it's a big topic because the ideas like culture and processes like globalizations, they are sometimes very intricate, complex, and multifaceted. It's very difficult to define them, particularly with the as you asked me to define globalization, and I would like to tell you that the idea and concept of globalization still faces definitional dilemmas. Many theorists have come up with their own definitions. I have my own definition. My definition, what I personally assume, is the most simplest one in the entire world, and approximately among the globalization literature. Although I haven't read all of it because it's given this single life I have, it must be very difficult. Globalization simply is a process, and it is a positive process and a negative process. It depends on the recipients. It depends who's on the other side. For the developed countries, the globalization outcomes can be different. For the underdeveloped countries or developing countries, the outcomes can be different. So, the purpose to tell you this is that globalization is different to different people. Globalization is different to different countries. It depends. Globalization is interacting with whom, right?
Mhm.
So globalization is a historical process. It is a mutual interaction and communication between different entities, nations, civilizations, communities, ethnicities, and so on. And it's also because I am a Muslim. So, as per my religious beliefs, globalization has its roots in religion as well. Because, as per my holy book, Allah says to that I have created you in different tribes and colors and caste and creeds to interact with each other.
Mhm.
So that's why it is that mankind is destined to interact with each other.
Mhm.
Today, globalization is at the forefront because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Many of the globalization theorists have come up with the philosophy that because of the globalization, the pandemic has spread so much because of the telecommunication means, transportation means, globalization offers. As you know, that the COVID-19, the coronavirus originated in some certain country, but within span of some time, it was able to spread all across the world, and it through same means of communication, air, land, and sea, and virus was everywhere. And today, it's the biggest, one of the biggest problem for the mankind. So here you see the tools and means and facilities of globalization which we use to ease our lives, like communication and transportation. They can become bane for us, like
Mhm.
spread of pandemic, like similarly the ideological spread, the spread of diseases, extremism, global warming, and so on. So it is the meaning of and definition of globalization is different to different people. For me, it's a process, and it can be very beneficial process. It helped a lot throughout history to reduce the poverty rates, unemployment rates. Globalization has excelled industrial revolutions. It has brought prosperity and development to nations. But other than that, it has created inequality as well. It has created climate problems as well. And the global growth is not equal for everyone. So I hope I am able to highlight different facets of globalization, including
So you
developing
mentioned
some idea.
You mentioned at the very end. You mentioned that how it starts with the main problem called globalization, but it slowly fades into other problems like let's say hatred, racism, financial crisis, and things like that. So what I'm trying to understand is that are these problems, these social factors, impacted through globalization, or they're just more highlighted through globalization?
Of course, globalization brought means of media
Mm-hmm.
and means of communication and internet, and it enabled us to connect with each other. It enabled civilizations and communities and ethnicities and nations to get connected with each other. So we as recipient of globalization process were able to see how other people are living in other societies and other cultures and other countries, what benefits they have and we don't have. So we were able to compare ourselves with other cultures and societies. So there, with the time, started to develop some sense of either superiority or inferiority
Yeah.
complex. Like you see these days, because of the spread of Islamophobia, and how the media presents and shapes uh, a public image of a certain religion, and all these issues. Globalization intentionally and unintentionally, accidentally, or any way, it has aided
Mhm.
spread of such phobias, and
So
you can
you also mentioned about how this is not a one-sided process, right? It's because the general idea of what we get from globalization is that there's a certain let's say certain part of the world, and when you say globalization, even though the way you explained it, the very definition means I believe the phrase "the world is a global village" comes from the same idea. So the expression itself is neutral. It just means that the world is connected more. But the general trend we see, like you were talking about the inferiority complex and the superiority complex, the general trend we see is that some nations acquire a superiority complex that are on the giving end, and the other nations who are on the receiving end, they develop an inferiority complex. So keeping this trend in mind, how would we still say that it's not a one-sided process? Like if a certain nation or certain part of the world is on the receiving end, so does that receiving end also somehow impact the giving end?
uh, the part of the world you are referring who are on the receiving end, they are not receiving as much as they deserve. So
Mm-hmm.
theoretically, globalization should not be a unequal process, but it has, unfortunately, it has become, because the flow of globalization is definitely coming from the one specific part of the world to the other part of the world. The developed countries today, they are controlling globalization through
Can you
their
shed
media,
some
through
more light on what would be the reason that certain countries or certain part of the world is on the giving end and the other part is on the receiving end? What would do you think is the reason?
what I personally feel, because they are the enablers of change, they are the
Oh,
trendsetters,
okay. Okay.
they are they are the generator of new ideas and new technologies. They are strong economies, so
Mm-hmm.
they can cause change. Like a few years back, if you remember, when there was a Ebola outbreak in Africa, and world was in a similar situation as it was today, and there was an issue of developing a consensus and generating a fund. Those days, I remember, U.S. administration was headed by President Obama, and the US administration played a very active role in containment of Ebola, uh, that epidemic, and they were able to generate funds worth billions of dollars. I don't think today anyone has that influence and power which can generate so much big amount of money to tackle uh, issues facing mankind. So definitely the flow of globalization is coming from some developed countries, and their systems and institutions are very strong and very effective. And further, there are international financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, and so on. So the system of, to put in a very political science sense, that the system of capitalism has become so dominating, and there is no alternate. Actually, we don't have any alternate. We have tried and tested various philosophies after the end of Second World War, like socialism, mixed economic system, Islamic economic system, and they have their own positives and negatives. But today, I, being a student of religious sciences, very strongly feel that we don't have any alternate to capitalism, and it's very effective.
Okay, okay. So would you say that as much as, let's just say, practical capitalism is, or as much as like that is the only system that is, working with all its parts, and even though it has its own problems and dark areas, but would you say that in a world designed to be a global world, capitalism is like the only system that can sustain, that can work? Because the way I see is that when we look at capitalism in one area, in one country, that's usually the framework we use for capitalism. So we say, oh, the rich and the poor in one country. But if you expand it to a global scale, then that, instead of people, that becomes countries, the rich countries and the poor countries. So do you think, like, as much as globalization has facilitated capitalism to the extent that now it has become a global system?
Of course, capitalism and neoliberalism, apologies, capitalism and neoliberalism as the foundational philosophies of globalization. So it is globalization itself run on these principles, where the profit maximization is the topmost objective. And you know how neoliberalism and capitalism operate. They ask and they demand for very less interference from the state, because at the end they have to promote trade liberalization. So you cannot have effective trade liberalization if the state is interfering so much. So there
Mhm.
needs to be a development of free market economy, trade liberalization, neoliberalism. So all these philosophies, they ask and demand for less and less interference from the state.
It is really
So
interesting that you have brought up the idea of the interference of state and how much freedom any person is given, or any state is given, because I believe that idea is very central to the concept of capitalism. And this is why I want to know more about, when we see capitalism becoming the global system that all the countries are using. So in a country framework, in within one country, we say that the state is this government of the country, and that is the interference that they would have. Who would you think is the central authority on a global scale that could monitor or police the entire, let's say, the world or the countries?
theoretically, every country has their own system of government, and they have
Mhm.
their own system of state and institutions which they use to run the affairs. But internationally, we have a United Nations. We have a lot of international institutions where everyone can collaborate with each other, and the difficulties and issues facing mankind, they can brought there and can be discussed. But I personally and very frankly feel that I don't see anyone more influential today than Facebook, than
Mhm.
Amazon, than WhatsApp, and the Elon Musk. You know, he's
Mhm.
this year. A lot of international magazines have declared Elon Musk Man of the Year, and he is not someone who is the head of a state, or he is not heading any international institution. He's a businessman.
Mhm. So
He's
that's
way
the
more
same trend
influential
that we
than.
see, that the involvement of capitalists in global affairs. You think that's
Of
maximizing?
course. We need to realize intellectually the day Jeff Bezos entered space, You remember Jeff Bezos, another
Yeah,
billionaire. These days we have billionaire races actually going on,
yeah.
which are as dramatic and as glamorous as Hollywood movies are. So
Mhm,
sometime back, I read somewhere that Jeff Bezos is the first industrialist, a billionaire to enter space, and he has his own plans for space exploration and tourism. So that was not only Jeff Bezos. It was not about Jeff Bezos entering space. It was also the entrance of capitalism in space exploration and affairs and
mhm,
space tourism. So you see how the process of industrialization has now entered in space.
mhm.
So
So
industry,
would you then also relate and connect the concept of industrialization to globalization? How closely are these
yes,
two connected?
they are their relationship is as strong as our soul is to our body.
Okay.
Industrial revolutions are engine of globalization. If you
Mhm,
remember, during from 1830s till 1920s, well, nearly almost all of the Islamic world was colonized, with the exception to Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. So what was happening from the colonized Muslim lands? The raw material was going in Europe, so the engine of industrialization can move strongly because
mhm,
they were coming big global wars.
mhm.
So industrialization is another thing. Uh,
So that specific period that you mentioned, and I think I would agree, any student of history would agree that there is a certain period of history where we see a certain continent of the world or certain nations of the world rapidly increasing. The global industrialization or the introduction of machinery and everything. So that is what gave them an edge that was so much far away than the rest of the world. So would you say,
from here,
and that connects to technological advancements? So
but
then,
we should. Yes, yes, Salman, that's a very good connection you have developed, and I totally agree with that. But we should not miss another one of the most important historical realities. Well, all when this was happening, industrial revolution and the process of globalization, expansion of this process and expansion of capitalism, we should look more deeply. What what
Mhm,
what we got? We got hundreds and hundreds years of colonialism, where
mhm,
people were enslaved and they were pushed into labor, and they were pushed to produce on the desires of colonial masters. And
mhm,
colonialism is the one of the major parts of world history. So, but at the back of it, colonialism itself is different to different people. Um, those who were colonial masters, they aimed to civilize the uncivilized.
mhm,
If you remember, white man's burden, and uh, and still, even colonialism still is continuing in different forms and different shades. The sense of inequality,
mhm,
injustice, the rising unemployment and poverty rates, the hunger, disease.
mhm,
Even you see today, the vaccines for COVID-19 pandemic, they are not equally distributed to every countries. It's power politics again. So we do received, we I will not say this, that we were recipients of industrial revolutions and globalization. We received benefits of it. We were exposed to technology which brought comfort to our lives, but we
mhm,
paid a heavy cost of it. We were never able, we were not, we didn't receive equal benefits. Rather, we
mhm.
received more debt, more burden, and more problems for our socio-economic systems,
Okay,
especially
okay,
the
that's an
developing
interesting
and
outlook.
underdeveloped countries.
Yeah, so for somebody of like my generation, we have half the picture. So like as soon as we open the eyes, the world has already been developed into a global village. So before I can even grasp to realize the impact that it is happening, because it's normal for me. That's the environment I grew up in. So I want to discuss more on the impact, but I think it's crucial that even though I understand that we can say technological advancement and industrialization is one of the key factors. But if one asks, why is it that only those countries are the ones who benefited or produced that mass level of industrialization? So that all goes to the reasoning as to why globalization came into existence in the first place. Can you shed some more light on that?
Having said everything, and your views also, as I said something when I was discussing with you the capitalism. I used the word alternate. I
Mhm,
feel that the mankind today, although I myself is a student, I'm also a teacher, and I have a very limited knowledge on things, and I'm always very advocate that in order to make arguments you need to have a full knowledge of it. I don't claim to have a full knowledge of it, and I always try to avoid making dramatic statements. But given my limited knowledge, I still can comfortably say that mankind don't currently they don't have any alternate to capitalism, alternate to globalization, any other way or process where mankind can interact with each other. So if we have to interact with each other for the mutual benefit, apologies, if we have to interact with each other for mutual benefits, that will have its own ideological basis, that will
mhm,
have own motivations and interest, because if I'm interacting with you, I should get something. Okay, so our interaction, it can be of economic, political, cultural, or religious nature, but it should benefit both of us.
mhm,
But given today, even Europe itself has realized, keeping the amount of inequality. No, Salman, you should think, why less than 1% of the world has occupied more than 80% of world's wealth. That's very easy to understand. Here lies the inequality. Why, few of the Middle Eastern countries, where we have seen, I will not name them, where we have witnessed so much war and bloodshed, they have huge resources, huge natural reserves of oil, but still
mhm,
there is so much bloodshed there, so much war there. Why? So much hunger. Look
mhm,
what's happening in Afghanistan now,
mhm,
invaded one and after another throughout the history, and what it has become. So why
mhm,
the process of industrialization and capitalism, if they were there, that much blessing which the
yeah.
Western theorists claim, why countries are in that deplorable condition
Mhm.
today? Why they were not able to remove hunger and poverty and disease?
So
Because we were
the
told that they had
pattern.
no alternatives.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Because after the Second World War, we were offered a choice: either we go with socialism or we go with capitalism. And there was a war, and eventually in that long war, capitalism won with the 1992 disintegration of Soviet Union, and there was a last man standing, capitalism, the neoliberal philosophy, and the world was a happy place and perfect as
Mhm,
the capitalist theorist and as the Western authors claim. But world never became that a place of happiness. The
mhm.
problems, the human sufferings. After 2011, we have a wave of extremism and terrorism, and millions of people lost their lives. We need a system in this world which can address effectively and
Mhm.
equally our problems,
So I want to
both
discuss more
equally,
about
both
the
for.
solutions that we can at least theorize, but I think it's essential to, before we actually like jump to the solutions, I think it's essential to understand what are the current impacts. Who are the ones who are actually, like, how does it impact the ones, like we said, on the giving end, and how does it impact the ones on the receiving end? So what is the impact of globalization on different countries and different religious and ethnic groups?
Impact varies. Impact varies. I'm from Pakistan, and I can comment on that. Being from this country, I'm not sure how other countries has received the impacts
Mhm,
of globalization. From the land I belong, globalization has impacted us in a lot of good ways, and globalization has impacted us also in few negative ways, particularly our social cultural values and religious values. That is also too because of the means of media, internet, and so on. But
mhm, mhm,
given my research of last 3 years, I cannot blame globalization exclusively for that, because how the countries are interacting with globalization, it also depends on their own socio-economic and political conditions, whether they are in position to take full advantage and benefit of globalization process or not. So a lot of things were happening in this. in my country, and because of the socio-economic conditions. And but still, Pakistan has remained a very responsible member of international community, has acted so well with in relations with other countries, very active member of United Nations and active participant of economic projects. Now these days we have a good collaboration and understanding with our Chinese counterparts. They have investing so much in Pakistan, and I hope and pray good things come to people of my country, hopefully.
You mentioned that not every nation or group has been able to receive globalization in the same way. So we know that the impact varies, but that also implies that, for example, the benefits. So everybody has not been able to achieve or to harvest the benefits of globalization in the same way. So essentially, the way I see it is it's an issue of compatibility, because, like we discussed, globalization heavily relies on the system of capitalism of one sort and other. So would you say that it's that compatibility, that since the giving nations are capitalist, and they want a system of capitalism to be in the countries that are there on the receiving end, and hence why we see
Yes.
countries that disagree with the capitalistic philosophies, for example, the countries that would try to empower communism or other ideologies, they have a certain clash with the major powers of the world.
Yes. You have given a very poetic explanation, and how you have covered the entire situation, and I would largely appreciate and agree with that. But there is always a method in madness.
Mhm,
In a globalized world, there are ways and means of doing things. They are
mhm,
not as blunt as we can be, because there is a system. As I
mhm,
told you, globalization is a system. It's a very resilient, very intelligent system which is surviving generations after generations, wars after wars. So system of capitalism and system of globalization is surviving and thriving very well. Why? Because it's very resilient. So there are institutions, they have their set system of protocols and how they work. Like when you take financial help from International Monetary Fund or World Bank, you take a loan, you have to sign certain documents, you have to adjust your system. Commonly they are known as Washington consensus. It's a set of terms and conditions. When you take loan from these financial institutions, you have to liberalize your system. You have to
mhm,
liberalize your system. You have to promote privatization. You have to downsize certain things. You have to listen to these financial institutions. Sometimes
mhm,
you may not like it, but you
mhm,
still have to do it, because you are at the receiving end. You are receiving money in after, when you meet the criteria and you change your own
mhm.
system and liberalize your economic conditions.
So
So these are the
I think I
systems.
agree that the like this entire scenario of the capitalistic giving hand, expecting certain conditions to be met, and that's how we know in the modern world that's how the system of favors work. So when they do a favor, they expect certain things to be met. That makes me want to discuss the idea of, because when we're talking about social media, the whole idea of social media is what in a more philosophical sense we call decentralization. So like when we discuss the giving hand and the receiving hand, so we assume that a certain part of the world or a certain person or institution is the authority, right, that must be followed. So now we see that there are some movements, some efforts that focus on decentralization. So for example, social media is one. So previously, for your voice to be voiced out, you would need so much effort, but now it's way easier. It's way easier, and anybody, any part of the world, with minimum basic requirements, he can voice out his voice to the world. And we have seen it in the past how this voicing out has affected the world in both positive and negative senses. Cryptocurrency is one of other aspects of the world where we see decentralization happening. So the way I like to see it is like where globalization tries to connect the entire world, and we discussed that theoretically that connection should be neutral, but what has practically happened is that one side became the receiving end, the other side became giving in. So
Of course.
do you think that the idea of decentralization that the world trend has been going towards, that can come make us closer to the theoretical idea of neutral globalization?
But that decentralization is not neutral. That
Mm-hmm.
decentralization is not neutral. Every day you see Twitter taking down accounts of
Okay.
people. They
Yeah.
deem those people who are saying things, and Twitter don't deem that appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
It's very selective. YouTube take down pages, and it's
Mhm.
so it's not neutral. I accept that they have given people, the population of the world, greater chances to express themselves, to align themselves with the global thought, with the global audience. But that's not neutral.
Mhm.
And if too much, to because there are people who have observed that the system is not playing neutral, it's not playing fair, from social media to trade rules.
Okay. Mhm.
Recently you have seen the during the Trump administration we had a very severe trade war between US and China,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the how the embargoes were placed on each other, and how the US trade, they were using employing the trade rules on Chinese counterpart. Fundamentally, it was about how it started, that there was a Chinese mobile communication company and the American mobile communication company, and there was a competition between that, and the American counterparts, they placed some objection, and they even arrested the chief financial officer of that particular company. I don't want to name anyone. So you see, those who have edge on technology, those who have access and power to do so, they are using all this in their own advantage.
Mhm.
uh,
So you would say that it's not completely decentralized. It's still the backhand is still capitalistic or authoritative.
Yes, of course, but it's an open field for everyone.
Mhm.
No one has pushed us or forced us to become part of the global world. It's an individual choice. You still can
Mhm.
log off your social media accounts and go and live in isolation, isolate yourself from everyone. We No one has pushed us. It's our individual choice. Like us, countries are making their own choices as well to be part of the system. No one is
Mhm.
forcing them. It's at the end of the day. That's why I say uh, we cannot claim that all the globalization is a source of all ills in the world. No, it's not. We cannot claim that, because if I decided to be part of a globalized process, I decided to live as a global citizen, that was my choice actually. no
Mhm.
one forced no one forced me to make a YouTube account and WhatsApp account. I did it myself. That's how countries are also behaving. They want to be
Mhm.
part of the system. No one wants to be left behind. No one can afford to live as isolationist, even countries or communities or ethnicity. So everyone wants to be a part of this process. But when we become part of this process, we have to upgrade the game. We have to
Yeah.
upgrade and strengthen our institutions and values, so we can interact with other countries and other systems confidently and honorably. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, not all countries have those effective mechanism and institutions, so naturally they are at the losing end.
So theoretically, if you say that several different countries, so and the context is that when I see European countries, I see that even though they are geographically tiny, but like they'll be landlocked and just next to each other. But say France will be speaking its own language, and Italy and other countries next to it, Spain and UK and all of them, they will be speaking their own languages. They'll have their own brands, they'll have their own systems. So theoretically speaking, would you say that if the individual authorities and institutions of the countries are strong enough to sustain their own identities, then the globalizational effect will not be one-sided, it will be more neutral?
It can be. If that happens, then we'll see. It's not happening now, and what happens in the future we are not sure. But that the point you have raised is very important. To preserve one identity in this global age is very, very important. If you will not prevent your social cultural values and identity and your religious beliefs, what will become? You will be homogenized. You will converge with the more dominating civilization. And Israeli historian Yuval Harari has already predicted a rise of a technological civilization, which
Okay.
has
Okay.
which is
Super.
a result of a lot of ethnicities, nationalities, and civilizations have homogenized and become one civilization. So the idea of diversity, which I quoted in the beginning of this talk, that the Quranic idea of diversity, when Allah says that I have created tribes and colors and different people, so you know each other. The idea of the idea of that diversity will be destroyed if
Mhm.
all if we are we have to homogenized into a single civilization. We will not be unique.
Mhm.
I'm from Pakistan. As a Pakistani citizen, I have my own social cultural traits, my own heritage, my own history, my own past and future, like you and everyone. So, but how I am being slowly and gradually
Mhm.
homogenized into a global citizenship,
So I
like
think the
the
idea of
talking a medium of English. We are
Mhm.
using all the technology. So how we are slowly and becoming, because I we are not able to produce something, the unique ideas, the unique technologies. So we are dependent on the system, on the globalized system. We are becoming a recipient of that system, and in doing so gradually, we are losing our own identity. We'll become like them.
So you mentioned the idea of diversity and how it's important to preserve diversity. And I think that brings about the idea of representation that recently has been we see it in all corners of the world that that neutral or central authorities or central representations should be more diverse. So, like for example, Hollywood or anything that the entire world watches, anything that is a global platform must be diverse enough that it represents all different diversities. So, like, do you think that's a good idea? Do you agree with that? Is that practically possible? And like the efforts that are currently being done
I
to
agree.
present diversity, are they any good?
I agree with every idea which preserves and respects and accepts diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Because as a student of history, I have seen throughout history a dominant culture, a powerful culture will always dominate or eat up a smaller, less dominant cultures. That's a historical phenomena. Nothing has changed. We should not forget the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin. It's a survival of the fittest. That's
Mm-hmm.
what has happened throughout history. The powerful will always occupy, dominate, or eat the less powerful. That's the entire history. How the history is progressing. That's
Mm-hmm.
what is actual in actuality. The colonialism was those with superior technology, weapons, and manpower, well trained, educated. They were sent to dominate less civilized society. That was very tragic. It should not have happened. So I support and I fully agree with any idea which preserves diversity, which respects diversity, which gives everyone its equal rights. It's
Mm,
not
I
up to me.
I really like how you mentioned the idea of diversity being important, not only because it's the individual's feelings and things like that. Like that's one component of it, but the other component is also that diversity plays an important part in the survival. So because and I mentioned that because the modern idea is that we talk about unity. So globalization is well world unity, the entire human beings uniting together. And theoretically speaking, and in many ways, it's practically proven that when we unite, let's say that the entire world unites, right, into one theoretical nation, we know that we can produce more technology, we can produce more technology, more advancements, more tools and skills. So if theoretically the globalization was not what was like in like 16th century or 18th century, where one person would become so powerful or so much on the giving hand that the other person would be in an inferiority complex or in a more violent or tragic situation like we have seen. But if it was more like the giving hand provides facilities and opportunities for the receiving hand to be at the same level. So would you say that theoretically that idea of globalization is possible?
Of course, why not? Why not? And given today, you have seen the inequality and injustice resulting from the system of globalization has produced so much reaction,
Mm-hmm.
produced so much reaction and extremism. More recently, in what happened, the events of 2001 and the subsequent launch of war on terrorism. Fundamentally, what the terrorists claimed, they claimed that their actions are because of the injustice.
Mm-hmm.
Have you forgotten what on 25th May 2020, when the person was killed in the United States, and what was that event, Salman? If you can help me, there
George
was
Floyd.
yeah, George Floyd. When the on 25th May 2020, that unfortunate event happened, when the police cop put his knee on the neck of George Floyd, what he said, you remember his sentence? He said, I can't breathe. I
Mm-hmm.
can't breathe. And nearly 50 years earlier, the France Fanon, the famous psychologist and theorist on colonialism, he wrote in his book that the injustice in the system makes him unable to breathe.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That's where the past becomes future and the past become present.
Mm-hmm.
The inequality, injustice, and all this what we have discussed, it has produced a severe reaction in today's world.
Mm-hmm.
It has produced a severe reaction in form of extremism, in form of those who, the people who are saying, look at the how every year when they have a G8 meeting in the heart of Europe somewhere, thousands and thousands of people gather to protest on the excesses of developed and these economies. Greta Thunberg, look, the climate activist, what we have done, what the process of industrialization has done to the mother nature.
Mm-hmm.
Even the rising sea levels now, because of the global warming, are causing the drowning of Maldives. We are on the verge of losing the entire civilization just because of the rising sea levels, which are fundamentally because our ecosystem has become so warm. Why? Because the developed countries are producing so much CO2 in our system, and they are not even accepting that.
Mm-hmm.
During the Trump administration, President Trump formally withdrew from the climate change negotiations. So you see who are the leading producers of carbon dioxide gas in our ecosystem, the industrial countries. We have nothing to do with that. The poor countries, the underdeveloped countries, we already don't have much industrialization. What we have to do with the global warming, but we are paying the price of it. We are, and our coming generations will pay the price of it. So, okay, I again repeat, industrialization, globalization, they brought some comforts to the mankind, but at a huge cost. And now we realize now. So I truly feel ashamed how I'll face my future generations when they will look at me and question me what type of world I left for them, full with misery, hunger, and poverty, and unemployment, and uncontrollable pandemic. This was not supposed to be a future of mankind.
But
And
once
now
again,
those
how would
who
you
have all
counter?
the resources, now those 1% who have the resources, they are now going into the space, finding another homeland for mankind.
Mm-hmm.
That's unfair, because I cannot afford a ticket to Mars, neither can you. So who will go to Mars then? Whoever will go there, they can afford that, leaving me behind to die here on the earth. You remember a very famous dialogue from the famous movie Interstellar, in which Cooper, the leading character of the movie, what he said? He said, we were born on earth, but we were not supposed to die on earth. But millions will die because of the mistakes and the negative consequences of rising from the process of globalization and industrialization.
But how would you say, like, because when we talk about the negative effects, we agree that some of them are brought by external factors also, like, internal economical crisis and clashes and inflation, the internal that have nothing to do with globalization, that have less to do globalization. So how much do you think there is truth to the statement that globalization actually aims to help the poorer countries to become more stabilized?
Yes, that's something we have to also consider. We cannot ignore that. We cannot ignore that the process of globalization has truly brought, as I said earlier already, it has brought comfort and convenience and benefits to the other parts of the world. There's no doubt about that.
Mhm.
But due to the inherent weaknesses of the countries, of their systems, especially those are underdeveloped and developing, inherent weaknesses of their systems, and they are unable to receive the full advantage and full benefit of the globalization process. So my expectation theoretically was, then the process of globalization should have addressed these limitations of the different
Mhm.
countries.
Mhm. But once
It
again,
should
does it
not be
not?
a linear.
But once again, do we know? Because we discussed that globalization has a certain, when the giving hand gives, it has a certain expectations. So once again, like you mentioned, that some countries and some parts of the world cannot fully receive the positives of the globalization. So I'm interested in how, what is the reason that they cannot receive those? Is it because they
Because
cannot meet the expectations of the more Western
the reason the
countries?
reason is simple. The reason is very simple in my understanding. The voices of we need a democracy among the
Mhm.
voices of globalization. We need equal representation of those nations and countries as well. Globalization is not a issue which is supposed to be managed by less than 10 countries, the powerful countries, the G8 countries, the developed countries, less than 10 or less than 20, for instance. So we need to make globalization more democratic, where
Mhm.
everyone can be equally represented and equally heard, and the genuine grievances of people should be addressed. So the globalization process currently is not very democratic. There are
Okay.
people, they gather every year in the Swiss mountains of Alps, and they discuss, we commonly known as the event of World Economic Summit. So,
Mhm.
and those gatherings, it should have an equal representation, and fair chance of representation should be given to every country involved with the globalization process. We need to bring democracy within the globalization process. So all the all the justified grievances, they should be addressed effectively.
Yes, I
And
think
those who are on a
like you mentioned earlier, that even if we choose to not be a part of globalization, we will still be impacted by it. So, if you're being impacted by it, we must have a say in it.
must have a say in it, and if you have any grievances, the system of globalization, and it should address that. It should
Mhm.
address that. So globalization becomes a beautiful journey for everyone. Globalization should be a source of happiness. It should not be a source of division. And I think the world has that wisdom. The developed countries, they have that wisdom. They have that power and influence where they can create happiness and blessings for everyone. But it depends what agenda and what objectives they are following. And I hope there are voices of sanity. I hope there are voices of wisdom among our those brotherly countries of the West and Europe, and they can do good for the mankind. And let's hope that happens. And everyone should have a say. Those who are living in this world belongs to them. It do not belong to certain group of people only. I was born here, I will die here. This world belongs equally to me and all the people living, whether they have anything to eat or they don't have anything to eat. The world belongs to equally to them as well.
So, in your research, in your findings as of now, because we discussed that there are evidently both positives and negatives of globalization. So, in your current findings, do you think that a system, theoretical, and maybe we can make amends towards it, but a theoretical system of globalization can practically work? And let's just say that theoretically, or as of right now, does the positives outweigh the negatives of globalization, or the other way around?
It can happen, and we have to, because we have no alternate.
Mhm.
The system of globalization and system of the philosophy of capitalism, we don't have any effective alternate for that as of now. So these should work for the betterment of mankind and for the creation of happiness. As far as I don't see any effective alternate to these systems, globalization has represents a system which is in place even with since the advent of time, since the advent
Mhm.
of time. So we don't have any other, and that will continue. That will continue. We have to make this system more democratic, so it can everyone can enjoy the benefits of it. And there should be no power politics, because the challenges facing mankind and challengings and the difficulties facing mankind today, only working together is the solution. If you will not work
Mhm.
together, like you have seen, as the world has shown some promise that what to address the problem of COVID-19 pandemic, everyone has worked
Yeah.
together with each other. Developed countries have worked with underdeveloped countries, and it has presented a very beautiful effort and resilient effort in order to counter the COVID-19 pandemic. That type of spirit and vigor we need. And I personally, I am a strong advocate with the reason should lead, the wisdom should lead, and those who have reason and wisdom, and they have shown throughout the history of being enabler of change uh, and producers of good technology which can bring ease and comfort to people. I don't mind giving them leadership. They can lead, but
Uh,
it should address everyone concern. And we need consensus, we need joint efforts, and the solution to our problems lies in working together.
So I like how you mentioned earlier that the impact that the globalization will make will evidently impact other countries whether they choose to be a part of it or not. So does that mean that once again diversity and discrete, because the way I see it, when globalization happens, whether it's neutral or not, it is going to erode away some discrete identities and ethnicities. So, do you think it's just it's natural, it's bound to happen?
It's not natural. It's not natural. It's unnatural to me. As I said already, that the globalization has caused some homogenization and
Mhm.
convergence of cultures, and a dominant culture has started to appear, which is more technological in its nature. So that convergence and homogenization should not take place. We need to preserve diversity. Even in Pakistan, a lot of indigenous local languages have disappeared because of the
Right.
dominance of English only. And you see, the English has become a very dominant language in the world today.
But
And as
when one presents this argument that okay, there's a certain village that speaks a language that not many people in the world speak. So if this certain village, let's say, learns English, so they will have better job perspective, they'll have better opportunities to better lifestyles. So that is like saying that if you trade away your discreteness, if you trade away your culture, then you can essentially get a better lifestyle. So do you think that it's a deal that's not worth it?
yes, of course, that's not worth it. But as again I told you before, that globalization is different to different people. So it depends
Mhm.
on that 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 community, that how big sacrifice they can make to enjoy the benefits of globalization. It's
Mhm.
individual choice, but some sacrifices has to be made, and people are making that. But it's up to them. Personally, for me as a student of religious sciences, I'm a strong advocate of preservation of culture and religious values and custom. I'm a strong advocate of that. I don't feel, I will never agree with to in order to just receive benefits of globalization and a modern day
Mhm.
world, you are able to sacrifice and compromise on your values. No, never. I that's not
So
that's
in
not
a theoretical globalization, in a theoretically neutral globalization, a village or a country should be able to participate and benefit from globalization without giving
yes.
up their language.
Yes, without, the search, some amount of influence will always be there, because when
Mhm.
civilizations interact with each other, they also
Mhm.
affect and influence each other. So
Yeah.
some amount of natural influence on both sides would be there, but that's natural, okay. But the consistent, organized, a methodological effort to dominate other culture, it should be prevented. We have seen
Okay.
the history of colonialism. what happened? Entirely foreign political and educational system was in placed on colonized lands. So we have seen in the history. So that's not something desirable. That's not what benefits mankind. It rather
Mhm.
creates more union. It rather produces more reaction. And you see the history of how the history of colonialism has changed the landscape of the world. Most of the modern nation states, they were born out of colonialism.
Yeah.
Sometimes they are not natural.
But
Sometimes
the
they are
way
not
I
natural.
understand, but the way I understand is that centralization or having a common ground is one of the key components of globalization to exist. So, for example, for different countries to globalize, to live in harmony or to work in harmony, they must, for example, speak the same language. So, do you think it's not, there is no other choice? It's natural that there will be one centralized language or culture that will, let's say, dominate. So what I'm trying to say is that, do you think globalization, because it globalization must have a centralized system, and that centralized system will be of some culture, and then arguably that culture has dominated and prevailed over the rest of the world? So do you think that's not a byproduct of globalization?
That's a very ideal situation, and that's a very theoretical situation. And we should not forget that in order to preserve the local culture, in order to preserve local languages, it's more responsibility of the governments than globalization forces.
Mhm.
So it is a more domestic issue. As I already said, I'm also a strong advocate of globalization, but to prevent your culture from
Mhm.
foreign ideologies, foreign culture,
Mhm.
it's a responsibility of people themselves. It's on people that how much they are doing to preserve their own culture and languages, because globalization is a big power. Globalization is coming with full force and a great impact.
Mhm.
You
So
see,
you
even
think it's inevitable?
it's the process is not I will not use word inevitable either, but the process of globalization is not reversible. Although COVID-19 pandemic has challenged the effectiveness of globalization, but I personally feel, since as I shared with you, that globalization is a very resilient process. It has survived world wars. It has survived national committees. It has survived cold wars and so on.
Yes,
But
so
globalization
that's
is
something
there.
that I think it's very clear over the course of history that one way
Yes,
or
yes.
another,
So
some form of globalization has always existed.
always it because it's very adaptive. It's always keeps on evolving. So is the system of capitalism. Capitalism has become is evolving, and it adjusts to changing realities very well. So the system
Mhm.
of globalization and these philosophies, they are very dynamic. So why they are succeeding and why they don't have any effective alternate now? Because they are very resilient systems and very adaptive.
Okay, I think I agree that they because and they have existed for so long because they are adoptive. But
Yes, yes, but if yeah, but you should not undermine with this. We cannot undermine the importance of regionalism. There is a
Mhm.
strong sense of regionalism. Like
Yeah.
we have seen European Union, there's an organization of Islamic countries and ASEAN and so much. So we have seen some sparks in regionalism as well. Let's see in future if the countries move more towards regionalism, because they are now realizing the risks and vulnerabilities resulting from globalization. Let's hope in future things, so countries
Mhm.
may move back to the regionalism and making trade more vibrant among their own regions than at the global scale. So yeah,
So,
as long as regional is there,
but
it can
what
always.
does the role of centralization remain? Like, would you say that an ideal globalization does not have, let's say, an international language or international clothing attire?
I don't feel if the system is central, it's equal, it's fair, we need any central language. I think it varies region to region. It varies
Mhm.
region to region. And if whenever we go out, we buy a laptop and we buy a mobile phone, the manual comes in many languages.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So with the globalization as well, the manual is not only in English; it's in many languages.
Yeah.
So let's hope that those who are leading the process of globalization, they are able to realize the importance of local culture and local languages, and the pupil also realizes the importance of their languages and their importance of their culture, and a beautiful blend can appear. I don't mind speaking English, because if like we are talking now, we are using a medium of English to create knowledge, and it's a
Yeah.
beautiful thing to do. Okay, so at the end of it, we are at the end of it, we are creating knowledge, and we are spreading knowledge by using the means of globalization. So
Mhm.
we hope wherever our voice reaches, it creates some awareness. So these
Yeah.
are more divine and more noble objectives than the medium of communication we are using. But eventually, we'll both go back to our individual life, personal lives,
Yeah.
after we finish this interview, and we speak the same language which we speak in Pakistan, our local beloved Urdu language.
Yeah. Yeah.
Back to reality.
Yeah, I think I agree, but that is one thing that I'm trying to understand, that since we know and we understand and we realize that globalization has existed for so long in one way or
Oh
another,
yes, yes,
always.
yes.
But in your personal in your experience of study, why then would you say that there is a certain hostility towards globalization? Like there's a
Yeah,
certain trend that people don't accept it.
particularly in those lands, particularly Muslim lands, which have been subjected to colonialism. There's a natural inclination among the people to see anything coming from the West with doubt,
Mhm.
because of the historical experiences.
Okay.
So people sometimes from underdeveloped societies who have remained subjected to colonialism and enslavement, or they have been subjected to wars and internal instabilities, they are naturally inclined to see anything coming from the West with doubt. Even you see
Yeah, yeah,
people in my country, they are not even, few of the people in my country, even they are not accepting polio vaccines. And
yeah.
you see there is a big fraction of people existing today who have are not getting vaccines of COVID-19 pandemic, and they associate a lot of conspiracy theories with the
Mhm.
COVID-19 pandemic vaccinations. So
Mhm.
there always a certain amount of doubt, paranoia attached with whatever coming from the West, among in particularly among in the Muslim societies. So that's because that's resulting from their historical experiences. So certain amount of doubt is always placed on such processes and
Yeah, I think
systems.
that's just fair enough because they have seen in the past they have seen it not turn out very well. So I think that's just
Yes.
fair. But what I'm more if I want to just expand this topic and I want to relate it back to the concept of accepting different cultures. So I want to know where is the line, because when we talk about diversity, we understand that there will be certain overlap, there will be certain influence of one culture over another. So do you think that when we talk about diversity or when we talk about globalization, different cultures living together, do you think it's okay for them to overlap and maybe adopt each other's values, or do you think that theoretically, because we talk about diversity and preservation of cultures, so do you think theoretically it is preferred that even though they're living together, but their original innate cultures remain intact?
That's possible as well. That's possible as well. Just look at the you can see the example of how China is involved interacting with the Western world and the culture and economic system. China is doing a lot to preserve their own culture, especially particularly the recent censorships they are coming with. So
Mhm.
it's the ultimate desire and intention of the government themselves, how far they can go to preserve their own identity. But certain some limited amount of influence will always be there.
Yeah.
But here in today's world, we see like you just see the example of Marvel movies and the superheroes. Like people are obsessed with that. I cannot name a single superhero from Pakistan.
Yeah.
Can you name any?
I don't
So
think
you
so.
see how even this one
Yeah.
thing is dominating the other cultures so strongly.
Mhm.
Like I have a lot of nieces and nephews in my home, Everyone has a school bag with the picture of Spider-Man and Hulk on it.
Mhm.
Like
So,
one of
but
the things I
theoretically
want to share.
speaking, now because these examples of movies and things like that, they like we can say, okay, they are harmless, but maybe there are some things within these movies or within the other ideas that are translated from one culture to another that are not, let's just say, agreed with that culture. So there's a conflict of, let's say, conflict of morality. So in that case, theoretically, we understand from a previous conversation that the culture or the morality of the giving or the more dominant nation will usually prevail, and we want to preserve it. But theoretically speaking, if a nation has to make a choice between preserving their cultural values, like you talked about the censorships of China, so do you think that a nation that has to make amends and make sacrifices, let's say, because we understand that when they are not, when a receiving hand is not on par with the giving hand, there are certain limitations to the benefits of globalization that they can receive. But then once again, theoretically, would you say that what is more important for a nation to sacrifice some benefits of globalization, but preserve their culture, their morality, their identity, or to go all in and accept the benefits of globalization?
The answer of that question varies so much, and it
Mhm.
depends on the choice of nations and countries. But what
Mhm.
I have observed more recently that sometimes governments make decisions on the in on the economic lines. I hope
Mhm.
you get my answer here. So
Mhm.
we have cultural values, but we have a big economic incentives and economic benefits. So it's natural that governments today, they most of the times decide more on the economic lines, so where they are receiving tangible economic or political benefits.
Mhm.
But we do have examples in modern day history where societies have preferred their own values and patriotism. It's particularly when it comes to languages. But the system and the socioeconomic pressures and the pressures of world economies are so strong that it's very natural to see uh, those in power deciding in favor of economic benefits.
True, true. What I've noticed personally is that only countries or areas of the world which are economically stable enough that they can stand their ground are the only ones that
Yes,
can preserve their
yes,
identity. So we see China,
yes,
for example. This is something I
yes,
noticed back in the Arabian Peninsula also, that the Arabs, no matter how much they expand upon their scale of development, etc., but still the Arabian civilization, usually they will have the Arabian attire, they'll speak the Arabian
yes,
languages. Usually I see their mobile
yes.
phones and everything is in Arabic also. So I think,
That's a
would
very
you
good
agree
example.
that
That's a very good
economic
example.
stability is a big factor in preserving
Yes,
culture?
that's a very beautiful example you have given.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's possible. So we see, as you have highlighted yourself, we see a combination of many things existing today when whenever we discuss as it's a very broad topic, and it's not a single experience. It's a very diverse and unique experience. So we see a bit of beauty and a bit of pain in the picture when we are discussing it. So you have highlighted the important examples.
Okay, okay. So I think the outlook is it's even though it revolves around the same ideas, it's infinitely vague. It expands so much, and my personal knowledge on this topic is very limited. So like I would just like to maybe wrap this up by asking you to just give me an overview and just a conclusion, a summary of anything you would like to finalize, wrapping up this topic.
Yeah, I really enjoyed discussing this with you. You were a very intellectually very active audience I had for this discussion. Since globalization, we have discussed world history, globalization, economic philosophies, international relations. Our discussion was a blend of so many things, and I
Yeah.
know in a limited time we cannot cover it all. But I hope our audience, they will definitely enjoy this talk, and they will be able to learn from our discussion. And that was a very good effort. I thoroughly enjoyed talking with you. But still, globalization is something very big. It's more
Mhm.
bigger than our imagination, and it's now has entered even in a space in form of space tourism and industrialization. So we don't know how far the story will go, but I want the story to end in a very beautiful, happy, and equal way for everyone. So future generations, they do not criticize us, and they we leave world in a good shape for them. And I hope and I wish in this lifetime I am able to see globalization as a very neutral and equal process for everyone. Globalization is a very is it's a great thing. I think everyone should participate in it to bring benefit to themselves and to others, and to create collective happiness. So globalization is our choice. This is
Yeah.
our choice, and we should make good decisions. And I hope we are able to create happiness and comfort for everyone. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thank you, sir. Once again, thank you so much for joining. I am pretty sure that the audience, the viewers, and the listeners will also enjoy this fruitful conversation as much as I did. Thank you so much. That was very insightful, and I hope the audience enjoys it as well. And with that, I think I'll end the episode today. Thank you so much.